So, today we're going to talk about research methodology, assessment, and theories of family violence, information that's going to correspond to Chapter 2 from your textbook. Really, what this chapter is getting at is the different problems that come up when trying to conduct research in the topic of family violence. So, after listening to today's lecture, you may walk away from this chapter thinking that it's almost impossible to conduct research in the field of family violence. There are a lot of problems, admittedly, in studying family violence in psychology, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't conduct research in family violence. It's a really important area in psychology to continue to study, not only so that we can gain more knowledge about this phenomena in the United States, but also so that we can help people that are currently experiencing family violence. So certainly there are going to be a number of challenges that come up when we try to study family violence in the United States. So there are different areas that we're going to talk about today that are common sources of problems for researchers that are trying to study different topics under the umbrella of family violence. One of those areas that we're going to talk about has to do with how we define different concepts that we try to study underneath family violence. Another potential source of problems comes from the actual populations that we try to study in relation to family violence. Additionally, we're going to talk about how we measure certain constructs that we're going to study underneath family violence. As you can imagine, we're also going to face a lot of problems with how we design our research studies and also how we analyze the statistics that correspond to the different research studies that we conduct. And then we're going to wrap up our discussion today by talking about problems with studying interventions for individuals that have experienced family violence, and also some ethical issues that come up when trying to research different areas underneath the umbrella of family violence. So let's first talk about problems that are related to how we define certain constructs underneath the umbrella of family violence. So what we're really talking about here is coming up with operational definitions for different topics underneath family violence. So for example, if we're interested in studying child abuse, how do we define what child abuse is? Are we defining it as child physical abuse? And relatedly, underneath that, how do we specifically define what child physical abuse is? How do we define child sexual abuse? How do we define child psychological abuse? All of these individual topics are complicated, and not all researchers agree on how to define those terms. Even just starting off and thinking about conducting research underneath family violence, we have this sort of prevailing problem of how did we define these terms that we're interested in studying. If you think about some of the more complicated topics that we might study in psychology underneath family violence, such as psychological abuse or sexual abuse, those are even harder terms to define and to agree upon as researchers and clinicians. So all of these definitional problems pose a larger issue in terms of how we can conduct research that is measuring the same things that we're talking about when we talk about a term like child abuse or sexual abuse. In addition to thinking about how do we define these constructs within psychology, we also have this problem of legal definitions that come up with these different topics. So just as there is a specific definition for child abuse within the field of psychology, or there might be several definitions for child abuse in psychology, we also have a legal definition of child abuse. And those definitions vary by the state that you're in. So we have this problem of what are we talking about, and do we agree about what we're talking about? In one study, researchers found that in 31 articles, so these are psychology journal articles, about child physical abuse, intimate partner violence, there are about 15 different definitions of the word abuse. So that's a pretty common occurrence when we try to study different topics underneath this umbrella of family violence. Just as an example, in my own research, so I study psychological abuse in dating partners, and one of the common problems that I come up against is that the term psychological abuse is often referred to as emotional abuse and verbal abuse or psychological maltreatment. There's sort of this myriad of terminology that is used when talking about more or less the same concept. And often people will define those concepts as different things. So how can we know that we're measuring the same thing and that we're talking about the same thing across different definitions and different studies? Another problem that comes up in trying to study different topics underneath the umbrella of family violence has to do with the populations that we try to study. So how do we sample certain populations? Often the statistics that you might see online or presented in certain federal reports, these sort of official statistics that talk about prevalence rates or different phenomena that are going on underneath the umbrella of family violence, aren't actually accurate. And there are lots of reasons why potentially these statistics aren't actually representing what might be going on in the United States. Often that has to do with who's reporting on these particular issues. So if you think about where these sources of data are coming from, you're talking about official reports from police departments and federal agencies and also state agencies, social services agencies. So really, we're only getting a sample of people that are reporting about how often their child might be experiencing abuse or how often they're experiencing domestic violence within their relationship. You're only getting those people that are reporting. So you're not getting information about people that aren't reporting to different agencies and law enforcement. So right away, we're not getting an accurate picture of what might actually be going on in the US. Additionally, most of the people that are reporting are only reporting the most serious crimes. So if you think about family violence and abuse, we're talking about a spectrum of severity. So there are going to be some more mild instances of abuse and aggression. There are going to be some more moderate instances of abuse and aggression, and there are certainly going to be more serious instances of abuse and aggression. So typically the people that are reporting are going to fall on that more serious end of the spectrum. So again, we're missing a large portion of data that has to do with the mild and moderate range. When we talk about the populations or the people that we're sampling from, we also have this issue of self-report. So often when we're collecting data, we're asking people to fill out measures that are self-report measures, or we're calling them on the phone and we're asking them to answer questions. So again, we're talking about people reporting based on their own experiences, and there are issues with that. So sometimes when people self-report, there is a motivation to present themselves in a particular way. Maybe they're trying to present themselves in a positive light, or maybe they're trying to present themselves sort of in a more negative light. Often when people are asked to report on whether or not they've experienced violence or perpetrated violence, there's a strong motivation to present themselves in a positive light, and so they're underreporting how often different things are occurring within their family. And on the flip side, often families that are trying to seek services and seek help are motivated to present themselves sort of in a more negative light, so over-reporting how frequently some of these behaviors are occurring so that they can obtain services. So self-report measures and self-report in general as a means of obtaining data comes with a lot of issues in terms of whether or not that data is accurate. Additionally, with self-report data, we're talking about asking people to recall specific events. So asking someone to recall how often they've experienced physical abuse within the last year. We know from psychology research that memory is not always the most accurate way. Our memories are fallible in a lot of senses, and so it can be difficult to ask people to recall accurately how often they've experienced abuse in the last year. So again, we're skewing our data with self-report, and it's making it difficult to get an accurate sense of how often these things are happening. Now, certainly we could get around this issue by trying to collect data through direct observation, but that often poses a problem underneath the umbrella of family violence because of issues of safety and ethical concerns. So when you think about a lot of the topics that we're going to discuss in this course, they're not topics that you can directly observe without breaking the law or without breaking some large ethical violation within psychology. Now, some researchers have tried to get around that by studying milder forms of family violence that aren't necessarily ethical concerns or breaking the law, But certainly, we also want to get information about the more serious forms of family violence, and those are pretty much impossible to directly observe. When we're talking about samples, we also have this problem of how representative is the sample that we're studying compared to the general population. So when we look at psychology studies that in the field of family violence, often they're criticized for not being generalizable to the greater population. So what I mean by that is sometimes we're studying college samples, right? So these are out of convenience. These are the participants that we have available to us. How representative are college students of the general population when it comes to issues of family violence? If we're using a clinical sample, maybe we're interested in studying women in domestic violence shelters. How representative is that sample of the general population of the United States? So this issue of our samples not being representative is also a common theme within family violence research.